Have you ever stopped to think about what's behind the devastating fires in Los Angeles? They are not just flames consuming everything in their path, but a sign of something much greater and more terrifying, something that goes beyond local destruction and spreads into the future of all humanity. The Red Horseman, described in Revelation, chapter 6, brings with him war, destruction, but also the suffering we are beginning to experience on a large scale. The fire we saw in Los Angeles is not a simple accident. It is a reflection of the growing violence and global destruction that the Red Horseman brings. The end times are closer than we imagine, and every fire, every war, every natural disaster is a warning that we are closer than we think. If you think this is an exaggeration, look at what is happening around you. Fires consuming entire forests, people losing everything they had, the impact on food production and natural resources. Are you prepared for what comes next? The Red Horseman has already awakened, and the fire we see today may just be the beginning of the destruction to come. Violence and war are spreading across the world, and just like the fire in Los Angeles, this destruction will no longer be local. It will affect all of us. This is not an isolated event. The world is facing an escalation of violence and destruction that reflects the arrival of the Great Tribulation, as described in the Scriptures. What we see in Los Angeles, with the flames consuming everything in their path, is just a reflection of the global violence taking over the planet. The Red Horseman symbolizes this growing wave of chaos, and the flames we see today may be a foreshadowing of what will come with war and scarcity. Now, think carefully. If the Red Horseman has already awakened, what comes next? Will we be ready to face the destruction that approaches, or will we be consumed by it, just as the fires consumed the city of Los Angeles? The answer is in our hands. It's time to prepare, to be attentive to the signs, and understand what is happening around us. Are you ready for what's to come? The fire has already started, and now, the only question is, what will you do in the face of the end times? If you want to understand more about how the fires and violence in Los Angeles connect to the prophecies of the Red Horseman, and what this means for the future of humanity, subscribe to the channel now. Don't wait any longer, because time is running out. Click the subscribe button and stay updated on the revelations that can change your view of current times. Prepare to face what's coming, because the Red Horseman has already awakened, and the end times are closer than you think. The Red Horseman, the horse of war and violence. Have you ever thought about how violence has taken over so many parts of the world? Everywhere you look, there seems to be no more peace. Wars, conflicts, destruction. Does that remind you of something? That is exactly what the Red Horseman of Revelation, chapter 6, represents: a wave of destruction, chaos, and of course, war. And this war is not just physical. It happens within us, in our societies, and even on our planet. Worse still, in many parts of the world, things seem to be getting worse. The fires in Los Angeles, for example, are a direct reflection of this violence that the Red Horseman brings with his sharp sword. Have you ever felt like the world is falling apart? Imagine a red horse running through the fields with a sword raised, ready to destroy everything in its path. It's not an easy scene to imagine, but it's exactly what Revelation, chapter 6, verse 4 describes: the Red Horseman who comes to bring war and destruction. Before we think about how this applies to our days, it's important to understand what this war means and how it spreads. The War of the Red Horseman is not just an armed conflict. It symbolizes growing violence, endless disputes, hatred, and division. But does all this relate to what we see happening around us today? Have you ever thought about how the fires in Los Angeles are a clear example of how violence and chaos can manifest unpredictably? The devastating fires that struck this city are not just an isolated event. They reflect an increasingly unstable world where violence and destruction spread both physically and emotionally. Fire, like war, consumes everything in its path. And violence, whether through fires or conflicts, always leaves a deep mark on society. War is not only fought on battlefields, it's in our daily lives. In a society where people always seem to be at odds, where anger and hatred spread like fire, how can we protect ourselves from growing violence? The answer is not to run from it, but to face it with wisdom and faith. This leads us to reflect on the role of peace in our lives. How can we be bearers of this peace amid chaos? The fires in Los Angeles, for example, didn't start out of nowhere. Like war, these natural disasters are linked to human actions. In many cases, Nature is affected by how we treat the world around us. Lack of care, the destruction of the land, and the abuse of natural resources, all these factors directly impact the rise of natural disasters. The fires in Los Angeles are just one of many consequences of this silent war we wage against our planet. Have you ever felt at war with the world? As if everything around you is collapsing and you were lost in the midst of chaos? This is a reflection of a world sinking into its own choices. And if we continue to let violence and destruction take over our lives and the world, the war of the Red Horsemen will only grow. Now, you must be wondering, but what can we do to change this? Well, the answer lies in how we react to this scenario. The first step is to become aware that violence is not something we can simply ignore. We, as individuals, are called to be agents of peace. It's not easy, and often it feels like we're fighting alone against a giant. But the truth is, when we unite for a greater good, we have the power to transform chaos into something positive. And remember, we cannot ignore what is happening around us. When we see violence taking over the world, we need to stop, reflect, and act. How can you be part of the solution? By adopting a posture of peace, seeking understanding, and above all, living according to divine values. We can begin to reverse the cycle of destruction and violence. And that is exactly what the Red Horseman teaches us. What comes next may surprise you. After all, the violence we see today is just the tip of the iceberg. The worst is yet to come, but the good news is that we are not alone in this battle. The next part of this story will reveal how fire, as destructive as war, can serve to purify and prepare the world for final judgment. And the question is, are we ready to face this? What do you think about this situation? How has violence impacted your life and environment? Leave your comment below. I would love to know your opinion about this. Fires in Los Angeles. The violence of fire as a reflection of the Red Rider. Have you ever stopped to think about the devastating impact of fires? We're not just talking about fire, but a force that consumes everything in its path. Fire is a powerful symbol of destruction, and when we see large fires like those that occurred in Los Angeles, it's not hard to see how it relates to the violence the Red Rider brings with him. The Red Rider, as described in Revelation chapter 6, verse 4, is the one who comes with a sharp sword, bringing war and destruction, devastating everything in his way. And this is exactly what we see when the fire spreads uncontrollably, mercilessly, destroying everything in its path. Have you ever thought about how the devastating fires in Los Angeles are a clear reflection of the violence and destruction the Red Rider brings? Fire, like war, makes no distinction about who stands in its way. It spreads, devastating without compassion, and the violence it generates is a reflection of what happens when chaos and war spread in the world. In the fires in Los Angeles, the flames not only burn the land and buildings, but also affect people's lives, destroy families, and cause irreparable damage. Just like war, fire consumes everything and everyone, without discrimination. The fires in Los Angeles do not arise randomly. They are, in fact, a physical reflection of a deeper reality, a world increasingly at war with itself. The war that the Red Rider symbolizes is not only on the battlefield, but also in our cities, in our communities, and even within ourselves. In Los Angeles, the violence of the fire, fueled by factors like global warming, environmental neglect, and poor political decisions, is just a reflection of how we are living in times of destruction and conflict. Fire, like war, makes no distinction about whom or what it affects, and when violence spreads, it destroys everything in its path, without mercy. Fire, like war, is an unpredictable and destructive force. It acts quickly, without warning, and leaves nothing behind. Imagine for a moment the fire taking over an entire city, destroying everything, leaving a trail of ashes and pain. The fires in Los Angeles are a metaphor for what happens when violence, whether physical or emotional, takes over a society. War, like fire, does not choose targets. It spreads and destroys everything it encounters. And the worst part is that when it arrives, there is not much to do. All that's left is to wait or try to survive the rubble left behind. And why does this happen? The answer lies in human nature and the way we deal with the world around us. We are living in times where violence, selfishness, and disrespect for the sacred are becoming increasingly common. Fires are not just a local tragedy, but a reflection of a society that has become insensitive, one that exploits its resources without considering the consequences. The more we ignore the warnings and consequences of our actions, the more the fire of violence will spread. And as we saw in Los Angeles, when the fire starts, it's very difficult to control it. Violence and destruction, like fire, are direct results of our choices. What we see in Los Angeles, with its devastating fires, is merely a physical reflection of the rising violence around the world. More and more, we are seeing the impact of our own behavior, whether in the environment, in the wars happening in different parts of the world, or in the internal divisions that push us further apart. Fire, like violence, reminds us that destruction starts within us and spreads, consuming everything as it moves forward. But just as fire can destroy, it can also purify. What depends on us is what we will do with what is left. Have you ever stopped to think about how fire could be a sign that we need to change the way we live? Fire can destroy everything, but it can also be a chance for renewal, for change. As we reflect on the fires in Los Angeles, we should not only think about the destruction, but also the lessons we can learn from this tragedy. What do we need to do to prevent the fire of violence from spreading further? How can we be part of the solution and not part of the problem? Perhaps the answer is to start with our own actions, with our behavior, and with the way we treat the world around us. Now, let's stop for a moment and think about what to do. What can we do to prevent the fire of violence from spreading even more? What can we do to rebuild peace and harmony? If you think we should take immediate action to face violence and seek peace, leave a like and tell us what you think about this in the comments. Now that we've reflected on the impact of fire and how it relates to the violence the Red Rider brings, it's time to move on to the next topic. The Red Rider does not only bring destruction, but is a reflection of a rise in global violence. In the next topic, we'll explore how the violence of the Red Rider is escalating and manifesting around the world. Get ready, because what comes next might surprise you. How is the Red Rider reflecting this rise in violence in our days? The Red Rider and the escalation of violence, a reflection of the fires in Los Angeles. Have you noticed how lately violence is growing to ever larger proportions? Not just in wars, but also in our daily lives, in our relationships, in the streets of big cities, and even in nature. The Red Rider of Revelation, chapter 6, verse 4, symbolizes exactly this growing violence, which is spreading rapidly throughout the world. He appears riding a red horse, wielding a sword, and brings with him a destruction that makes no distinctions, a force that moves forward mercilessly, destroying everything in its path. This violence is not only physical, but also emotional and spiritual. The Red Rider, with his sharp sword, represents the increase of conflict, the escalation of violence in all aspects of human life. And when we look at the fires in Los Angeles, we see a clear reflection of this violence, which, in many ways, can be associated with what the Red Rider brings. The violence that destroys peace, that separates people, that causes suffering, that devastates both physically and emotionally. The fire in Los Angeles is not just a local tragedy. It is a symbol of a society out of control, one that is increasingly at war with itself and with the world around it. Have you ever stopped to think about how the fires in Los Angeles represent what happens when violence escalates to an uncontrollable level? When we see these flames consuming a city, destroying everything in their path, we cannot help but think that this is just a small sample of what happens when global violence intensifies. Every fire, every war, every conflict we see in the news is like a spark feeding the fire of destruction that the Red Rider brings. And the question is, what are we doing to stop this fire from spreading even further? The fires in Los Angeles do not come out of nowhere. They are the result of a series of factors that reflect how humanity has been dealing with violence, destruction, and disregard for divine values. Negligence with nature, carelessness with the environment, human selfishness, and the growing lack of respect for others have created an environment where violence, whether physical or emotional, is on the rise. And what the fires are telling us is that if we do not act with wisdom and responsibility, disasters, both natural and social, will continue to increase. Fire is not the cause of everything, but a clear sign of what is happening with our society. It does not arise spontaneously. It is fueled by our choices, by the way we deal with the world around us. Every decision we make, every attitude we adopt regarding nature, others, and ourselves is like a spark that can later trigger a great explosion. The Red Rider teaches us that violence is a vicious cycle. When we begin to feed this cycle, it grows and spreads without stopping until it consumes everything. And we're not just talking about physical violence. The The Red Rider also symbolizes emotional and spiritual violence, which is often ignored. Think about personal relationships, family conflicts, the hatred that spreads on social media. This is no less destructive than any war. Violence starts within each one of us and spreads out to the world around us. We are living in times where the lack of empathy and understanding is leading society to a breaking point, where people seem more willing to fight than to understand and help one another. The fires in Los Angeles are just a reflection of the violence we see every day in our daily lives. But what is even more alarming is that these disasters are becoming more frequent. We are witnessing an increase in natural disasters around the world, and this is no coincidence. Human violence, whether in the form of open conflicts or environmental negligence, is reflected in the rise of natural disasters. What we are seeing in Los Angeles may actually be just the beginning. Nature is responding to the damage we've caused to it. The Red Rider is not just talking about war, but about how the violence we create in the world has a price, a very high cost for all of us. The escalation of violence, whether in the physical world, in our relationships, or in the way we treat the planet, is leading to the collapse of our social and environmental structures. The rise of natural catastrophes like fires, hurricanes, and earthquakes is a direct reflection of this destructive behavior. And as a society, if we keep ignoring these signs, are we really prepared for what comes next? When we talk about the escalation of violence, we're talking about a continuous process of degradation and destruction. And we cannot ignore that the fires in Los Angeles and other natural disasters are a direct consequence of our collective and individual actions. If we don't change the course of things, if we don't start acting with more wisdom, love, and respect for our planet and each other, violence will continue to escalate, and what we are seeing today will be just a small part of a large global disaster. It's time for us to take a conscious and responsible attitude to prevent violence from spreading any further. What are we doing to change this scenario? How can we be the change we so desperately need? Think about it. If you believe the time to change is now, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell to receive more important content like this. Now, if you think the violence we are witnessing is just a phase, you are very wrong. What comes next is even more alarming. In the next topic, we'll explore how the violence in Los Angeles is not only a sign of a local conflict, but a foreshadowing of the great global war that is coming. How does this connect with biblical prophecies? The violence in Los Angeles, the beginning of the great global war. The devastating fires in Los Angeles are not just a local tragedy, they are a reflection of what is happening in many parts of the world. And more than that, they are a clear sign that something much greater is coming. As we've already seen, the fires are a reflection of the growing violence, and this violence is everywhere in the world. Now, the question is, what does this mean for the future? How can we understand these events within the context of biblical prophecies? The answer lies in how these catastrophes are preparing us for the great global war, a conflict of unimaginable proportions that, according to the scriptures, will affect the entire world. Have you ever stopped to think about how local violence, like the fires in Los Angeles, could be a sign of what's to come on a global scale? In many ways, the fires in Los Angeles can be seen as a warning, as a preview of the chaos and destruction the Red Rider of Revelation, chapter 6, verse 4, brings with him. The Red Rider represents war, the rampant violence that chooses no victims. And just like fire, violence is not limited to one place. It spreads, reaching everyone around it. When we see an entire city consumed by flames, we can't help but think, is this just the beginning? Are we witnessing the first signs of a global war approaching? The fires in Los Angeles were not just an isolated tragedy. They are part of a growing pattern of violence and destruction happening in many parts of the world. Whether through civil wars, more frequent and devastating natural disasters like we see in floods, hurricanes, and droughts, or even through escalating political tensions, all of this is showing us one clear picture: a world on the brink of the Great Tribulation. What the fires in Los Angeles teach us is that violence is no longer a local problem, but a global one. The flames that consume the city are just a reflection of a much larger fire, one that is about to spread across the entire planet. If you look at what is happening around the world, it's impossible to ignore the correlation between these isolated incidents and what may be the beginning of a great global war. Worldwide, we see growing divisions between countries, escalating political tensions, and violence being normalized in various societies. It's not just the fires happening in Los Angeles, but also in places like Australia, the Amazon, California, and even other cities around the world. All of this is a representation of how global violence is becoming an increasingly imminent reality. The fires, natural disasters, and conflicts in various regions are like pieces of a puzzle that are fitting together, forming a terrifying image of the future. What is at stake is not just a local war, but violence that will affect the entire world. And the worst part is that most people still don't realize what is happening. We are at a critical point, where the signs are right before us, but many are still not willing to see the gravity of the situation. When we reflect on the impact of the fires, we cannot forget what is behind them: negligence, lack of empathy, disregard for the planet, and the increasing political and social divisions. The violence in Los Angeles is not a simple coincidence, but a clear sign that the world is preparing for what is to come. The Great Global War, as mentioned in the Prophecies of Revelation, chapter 16, verse 16, will be a conflict that involves all the nations of the world, bringing the planet to the brink of destruction. And the signs are everywhere. Geopolitical tensions, military conflicts, radicalization of different ideologies, and the growing social divide. We are watching the world fall apart into a scenario of conflict and destruction, just like what the Red Rider brings with him. The violence in Los Angeles is a warning, a forecast of what is to come. We cannot look at these events merely as local tragedies, but as reflections of what may happen on a global scale. The fire that consumed the city is a symbol of how violence can spread, and how the destruction of one part of the world can affect the rest. What we are seeing in the fires, in the escalation of violence, and in natural disasters is just a foreshadowing of what the Bible has already warned us. The world is heading toward a great tribulation, where everything we know and take for granted may be destroyed. And the question is, are we ready for what is to come? How can we protect ourselves from all of this? What do we need to do now to prepare for the great global war and the impact of the violence happening around us? We cannot wait for change to happen on its own. Each of us needs to start acting, reflecting on our choices, on our attitudes toward the world and others. If you are ready to face the reality of global violence and want to make a difference, leave your comment here below. Don't miss the next topic, where we will explore how the Red Rider not only brings destruction, but is also a reflection of global suffering. Fire can be a sign of purification, but what does it purify? What can we learn from this destruction, and how does it connect with the suffering of the world? This journey still has much to reveal, and you won't want to miss what comes next. The Red Rider and the suffering of the world. Fire as a symbol of purification. The Red Rider, as described in Revelation, chapter 6, verse 4, is a powerful and terrifying figure. He brings not only war, but also suffering and purification. He is the harbinger of destruction, but as contradictory as it may seem, he is also related to a process of purification. This concept of purification through suffering is something that, in some way, we can all understand. Because in our own lives, we often go through difficult times that end up transforming us. And this is exactly what the Red Rider represents: violence and destruction as a means of transforming and purifying the world. When we look at the fires in Los Angeles, we see more than just a local tragedy. The fires represent something bigger, something happening on a global scale. They are a manifestation of suffering, but also a symbol of purification. Fire, just like the war that the Red Rider brings, serves to destroy, but at the same time serves to cleanse and purify. The fire that consumes forests, cities, and everything it encounters on its way can also be seen as a form of preparation for something more important: the final judgment. In many cultures and traditions, fire has been seen as a symbol of purification, of a new beginning that emerges after destruction. Have you ever stopped to think about how the fires in Los Angeles could be a manifestation of a broader process of purification and transformation? When fire consumes everything, it destroys, but it also allows something new to be born. This process of purification is painful but necessary. Just as the land needs to be purified and renewed after a fire, the world as a whole also needs to go through a purification process before the final judgment is completed. The fires are, therefore, not just a tragedy, but a foretaste of a future that is more purified and transformed, in which violence and destruction, symbolized by the Red Rider, are just the beginning of a great change. Fire, both in the Bible and in nature, has always represented transformation. The purification of fire is a powerful metaphor for what the world is experiencing. The violence that the Red Rider brings is not just senseless destruction, but part of a divine and necessary process. Humanity has been living distance from divine principles for so long, and for transformation to occur, suffering is often necessary. Fire serves to remove what is impure, to cleanse what is dirty, to prepare the ground for something new and purer. The suffering of the world, symbolized by fire, is, therefore, a reflection of a divine process of purification. The fires in Los Angeles can be seen as a physical manifestation of this global purification. When we see the fire consuming everything, we can reflect on the fact that, in some way, humanity is undergoing a similar process. Suffering, disasters, and difficulties are a way to remove impurities, to prepare us for something greater that is to come. But what happens after the fire? After the fire comes renewal, the creation of something new and stronger. After the land is burned, it becomes more fertile. Fire, therefore, is not just destruction, but a preparation for a new beginning. The great transformation of the world that we are witnessing is exactly that, a necessary change for the final judgment to occur. The suffering that humanity is experiencing is not an end, but a means to achieve a new beginning, a new world order, where peace will be restored. How does the violence and suffering we see today relate to the transformation of the world? What we are seeing in the world, with the fires, wars, and widespread destruction, is just the beginning of this purification process. Suffering prepares us for what is to come. Instead of looking at difficulties as something negative, we need to understand them as part of a divine plan for transformation. The Red Rider may bring destruction, but he is also preparing the world for the final judgment, and it is only through this purification that we can reach a new heaven and a new earth, as promised in the scriptures. The fire that comes with the Red Rider is not just a farewell to the old world, but the arrival of a new era. And it is in this process of purification that we are called to reflect on what really matters. What do we need to eliminate from our lives? What do we need to purify in our hearts? The flames of fire are a metaphor for this internal and global change. Fire is what burns the impurities, and what survives is what will be rebuilt in the end. Now, when we reflect on the purification that is happening in the world, we must ask ourselves what to do with what is surviving the fire. How can we help transform this world? How can we be part of the change that the fire of the Red Rider is bringing? Your part is essential for the transformation to happen in a positive way. Now, more than ever, we need to be prepared to face this purification and help shape a better world. If you want to learn more about how fire can be a sign of renewal, don't forget to download our ebook, which is available in the link in the first pinned comment. Now, after reflecting on how fire can purify and transform the world, it's time to look at what comes next. The Red Rider is not just a figure of destruction, but he leads us to a place of deep reflection on global suffering. In the next topic, we will explore how violence and fires are clear signs that the Red Rider is here, and how this impacts the world more and more. Suffering is spreading, but transformation is also happening. Fires and violence. Is the Red Rider here? Have you ever stopped to observe the increase in violence, natural disasters, and destruction in various parts of the world? An alarming scenario is unfolding before our eyes, and we cannot ignore the signs. The fires in Los Angeles are just one of many examples of how violence and chaos are growing unchecked, reflecting the impact of war and destruction brought by the Red Rider. This rider, described in Revelation, chapter 6, verse 4, brings with him a sword and immense power of destruction, representing a growing violence that affects everything around it. And if you look around, you will see that the world is becoming more like this unchecked destruction. Can you see the correlation between the fires in Los Angeles and what the Red Rider symbolizes? They are not just localized fires, but a reflection of a global phenomenon. Violence and natural disasters are becoming more frequent and intense. And this is no coincidence. The fires that consume Los Angeles are a physical manifestation of the growing violence sweeping the world, fueled by conflict, war, and human indifference. The Red Rider, with his sword of destruction, symbolizes this violence, and as the world approaches the Great Tribulation, we are starting to see the clearest signs of its arrival. The fires are not just a natural disaster. They are a sign of something deeper, a sign that global violence is growing and reaching a point of global scale. When fire takes over entire cities, when we see homeless families and the destruction of natural habitats, we are facing a reflection of the impact a war spreading across the world. Global violence is becoming a more tangible reality and no longer a distant scenario. We can no longer ignore the signs that are right before us. The violence we see, whether in fires, wars, or natural disasters, is a reflection of what the Red Rider brings. He is not just a mythical figure, but a symbol of the rising violence that affects us directly and indirectly. The wars we see around the world, the political tensions, the armed conflicts in various regions, all of these are manifestations of the violence the Red Rider represents. Every disaster, every attack, every fire, every conflict is a small reflection of the global violence taking shape. But what does all of this mean for the future? The world is clearly drifting away from divine principles, morality, and peace. We are living in times of escalating violence, where the values that sustain a harmonious society are being eroded. And, as we can see, fires, disasters, and violence are not just consequences of human action, but also signs that we are heading toward the times of tribulation that are approaching. The Bible warns us about these difficult times, and the signs are becoming more and more evident. The fires, the wars, and the violence are just the tip of the iceberg. Can you see the urgency to prepare for what's coming? The question is no longer, will we face tribulations, but are we prepared to face them? The rise in natural disasters and violence is a clear reflection that the times of tribulation are near. We can no longer wait to act. The biblical prophecies are being fulfilled before our eyes, and every violent event, every disaster, every fire, is a reminder that the world is approaching the final judgment. What can we do to prepare for this scenario? Preparation is not only physical but also spiritual. We must turn to faith, to divine truth, and begin to live according to the principles that have been given to us. The Red Rider reminds us that violence has a cost, and that cost is being paid by all of humanity. The suffering and destruction we see in the world are not accidents, but a reflection of our own indifference and departure from God. And as we continue to face these turbulent times, the question is, how are we preparing for what is to come? We cannot ignore what is happening around us. The fires in Los Angeles, the violence in the streets, the conflicts around the world are just a small sample of a darker future. If we don't take action now, the consequences will be even more devastating. The violence of the Red Rider is closer than ever, and with every fire, every war, the world draws closer to the Great Tribulation. We are on the brink of something much bigger, and if we don't begin to act, we will be at the mercy of the growing violence that is spreading across the planet. If you believe the time to prepare is now, subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell to receive updates about what's coming. We can no longer wait for things to improve on their own. Now is the time to take action. Now, after reflecting on the signs of violence and the natural disasters that are intensifying, in the next topic, we will explore how all of this connects to the final judgment. The violence and fires we are seeing are a clear sign that the Red Rider is here, and the final judgment is near. The Red Rider in the Great Tribulation. How the fires are a sign of judgment. The fires in Los Angeles are not just an isolated tragedy. They are a reflection, a symbol of something bigger happening in the world, something unfolding before our eyes. If you have carefully observed the consequences of these fires and other disasters around the world, you may start to notice a deep connection with the biblical prophecies, specifically with what is described in Revelation, chapter 16, about God's judgments. The Red Rider, who brings destruction and war, is directly related to the destruction of human systems that we see reflected in the fires and other natural disasters. Have you ever realized how the fires in Los Angeles could be a clear warning that divine judgment is coming? In Revelation, chapter 16, we are presented with a series of judgments that come upon the earth as a reflection of human actions and turning away from God. Fire, as one of the instruments of judgment, is used to purify and destroy, just as we see in the account of judgments on the wicked. The Red Rider, with his sword and destruction, brings forth this bitter reality: violence and suffering as a result of a world that has chosen to turn away from divine values. The fires in Los Angeles, with their uncontrollable flames, are not just a natural disaster caused by extreme weather conditions. They actually represent a clear sign of judgment that is approaching. Fire, in the scriptures, is a powerful symbol of purification, but also of destruction. Revelation, chapter 16, describes the bowls of God's wrath, where fire, flames, and destruction are used to purify the earth, destroying everything that is impure. This is exactly what the fires are showing us. The world is being purified through suffering and destruction as preparation for the final judgment. Can you see the parallel between the fire consuming Los Angeles and the divine judgment in Revelation? When fires take over a city, they destroy everything in their path. Fire makes no distinction. It consumes indiscriminately. In the same way, the divine judgment described in Revelation, chapter 16, makes no distinction. It hits the wicked and those who have turned away from God's ways. The purification that comes through fire is a reflection of the need to cleanse the evil in the world, to destroy the failed and corrupt human systems that feed violence, greed, and destruction. The Red Rider does not only bring war, but the destruction of everything that is impure, including human systems and structures that draw us away from God. What can we learn from the fires in Los Angeles and other natural disasters? They are a reminder that God's judgment is approaching. Fire is a clear warning that things will not continue as before. In many parts of the world, we see an increase in natural disasters as that the earth is responding to human behavior, neglect of the environment, and abandonment of divine principles. Fires are not just accidents, they are warnings. They show us that the world is in a process of purification and that human systems, based on selfishness, greed, and violence, cannot last forever. The question remains, are we ready for the judgment? The fires, like other disasters, are a reflection of what is to come. The Red Rider is showing us that God's judgment is near, and the violence and destruction we see in the world are signs that the Great Tribulation is coming. We can no longer ignore these signs. They are happening right before our eyes, and we must act before it is too late. The suffering and destruction we see in the world are just the first signs that divine judgment is on its way, and the only way to escape it is to turn to God, change our actions, and seek true peace and purification. If you believe that divine judgment is closer than ever, leave a like and reflect on what is happening around you. How can we prepare for what is to come? Are we ready to face the consequences of the destruction of human systems? Or will we continue ignoring the signs that humanity is heading toward the final judgment? Now, with these signs of divine judgment happening around us, it's time to reflect on what comes next. In the next topic, we will explore how the violence and fires we have been seeing are not just local consequences, but a sign of what is to come on a global scale. How do violence and disasters reflect the impact of a great global war? How does this connect with the Red Rider and the Great Tribulation? Don't miss it. What comes next is crucial to understanding the future. War and conflicts. How the fires in Los Angeles reflect global violence. The fires in Los Angeles, devastating in their magnitude, are not just a local tragedy, but a reflection of something much larger and deeper. The growing climate of global violence and destruction. These fires are a powerful symbol of how the world is becoming increasingly unstable, and how local disasters can, in fact, represent something much more vast and apocalyptic. When we observe the devastating fire that consumed the city, we see a direct analogy with the conflicts, wars, and destruction spreading across the planet. Fire makes no distinction between who or what it affects, just as global violence spares no one and reaches every corner of the world. What is happening in Los Angeles is not an isolated case. The fires in Los Angeles reflect what is happening in many parts of the world, an escalation of violence and destruction, where the boundaries between countries and nations are becoming increasingly blurred. The fire that consumes the city is just a visible expression of the violence that is taking on global proportions. The Red Rider, described in Revelation, chapter 6, verse 4, brings with him a sharp sword, representing the war and destruction that spread uncontrollably, affecting nations and continents in a way we have never seen before. The fire that comes with the fires in Los Angeles is not just a burning of foliage, but a manifestation of what is to come in the entire world. The violence we see today, whether through wars or natural disasters like the fires, is the beginning of a broader apocalyptic scenario. We are witnessing an increase in the number of conflicts, political and social tensions, which are spreading rapidly, creating an increasingly volatile situation in various regions. The fire in Los Angeles is an analogy for this global scenario of imminent destruction, where the entire world is being consumed by a fire of violence that grows every day. Have you ever stopped to think about how local violence can reflect a global conflict? When a city like Los Angeles is consumed by such devastating fires, we cannot help but think that the same could happen on a global scale. Every fire, every conflict, every war in different parts of the world is a flame that spreads quickly, affecting every corner of the earth. Violence is no longer an isolated problem, but a global reality that spreads as quickly as fire. The Red Rider shows us that war and destruction will no longer be confined to one region, but will affect all the nations of the planet. The violence that comes with the Red Rider not only affects the places where open conflicts are happening, but spreads across the world, igniting the spirit of conflict in all nations. Fire, as a symbol of war, does not choose territory. It burns indiscriminately, just as global violence is taking over our societies. And the worst part is that if we do not take action, this violence will continue to grow, consuming everything in its way. The fires in Los Angeles, therefore, are not just a local tragedy, but a reflection of how the world is becoming increasingly vulnerable to this violence, which ultimately will result in a great global conflict. What do the fires and violence show us about the future? If you think the fires today are just a matter of natural disasters and failures in the firefighting system, you are missing a crucial point. What we see in Los Angeles is a reflection of a global violence that is spreading out of control. Just like the fire consuming the city, violence is burning the bridges of peace, harmony, and stability that once sustained the nations. We are watching the world sink further into a state of chaos and destruction, where the borders between nations become irrelevant and conflicts begin to affect everyone around us. Global violence, like the fire that spreads through California, can no longer be ignored. What we are seeing now is just a beginning. If the flames consuming Los Angeles are a metaphor for what is to come, we must understand that the worst is yet to come. The Red Rider is not a distant or irrelevant figure. He is a reflection of the current reality and the future catastrophes that will affect the entire world. Violence, war, and conflicts are no longer isolated problems, but part of a global scenario of destruction that is already in progress. But how should we act in the face of all this? The first step is to recognize what is happening around us and understand that global violence is not something we can ignore or wait to pass. We must prepare for the impact of the Red Rider, who brings with him the destruction of human systems and the arrival of a global conflict. The only way to truly change this reality is to start acting now, with wisdom and unity, seeking peace where possible and preparing for the difficult times ahead. If you believe we must prepare now, leave your comment below and share your ideas on how the world can face the global violence that is coming. And now, after reflecting on the impact of global violence and how the fires in Los Angeles reflect this, in the next topic, we will explore how violence and natural disasters prepare us for a future of scarcity. In the next topic, we will talk about how the violence of the Red Rider relates to hunger and how the fires are preparing the world for the scarcity that is coming. The Red Rider and hunger. How the fires prepare the world for scarcity. The fires in Los Angeles, although devastating for the city and its inhabitants, also have a much larger impact than we initially imagined. They are more than local tragedies. They are signs of a darker future, where scarcity and hunger will be global issues. When the Red Rider is described in Revelation, chapter 6, verse 4, he is associated not only with war and destruction, but also with scarcity and hunger. The Rider comes with the power of destruction, but what he brings with him is also a lack of resources, a supply crisis that affects everyone. Have you ever noticed how, in every large-scale fire, such as the one in Los Angeles, food and natural resource production is affected? Fires like this, which destroy vast areas of land, not only consume properties and forests, but also destroy critical resources for human survival, such as agriculture and water supply. Food production decreases dramatically, creating a scarcity that affects thousands, even millions of people. This phenomenon is not exclusive to Los Angeles. In various parts of the world, we see that natural disasters like wildfires, floods, and even hurricanes have affected food production capacity, creating a scenario of scarcity. What can we learn from the connection between fires and hunger in the context of the Red Rider? The impact of fires on food production is a direct reflection of what the Red Rider brings with him. By spreading destruction, he causes a decline in the natural resources needed to sustain human life. Imagine for a moment how a massive fire can destroy crop fields, which in turn affects the food production that reaches our tables. What we are seeing in Los Angeles is a small sample of a phenomenon that could become global. As resources become more scarce, hunger and poverty spread. This phenomenon, which seems distant, is closer to us than we think. We are living in a world where resource scarcity is becoming an increasing reality. not only because of poor human management, but also due to natural disasters fueled by the neglect of the planet. The fires in Los Angeles are not just isolated accidents, but represent a growing trend of global vulnerability. Areas that were once fertile and productive are now being burned, becoming barren, while the need for food and resources grows. This is just a glimpse of a future of scarcity, where vital resources are becoming increasingly difficult to obtain and the world as a whole is approaching an unprecedented crisis. How does this scarcity affect the world on a global scale? When food production decreases, economies that depend on these productions begin to collapse. Populations that once had easy access to fresh, basic foods now face immense difficulties in getting enough to sustain themselves. Wars for resources, social tensions, and forced migrations increase, and hunger begins to spread, especially in the poorest and most vulnerable regions. Scarcity not only threatens food security, but also creates social and political conflicts, which can easily escalate into larger and more destructive wars. As described in the Book of Revelation, the Red Rider, with his sword and destruction, reflects this resource crisis and its connection to the collapse of civilization as we know it. Hunger and scarcity are approaching more quickly than we imagine. The fires in Los Angeles are a warning, a sign that the world is becoming increasingly vulnerable. We are on the brink of a great collapse. Natural disasters are increasing in frequency and intensity, destroying the natural resources essential for human survival. Food production, water distribution, fishing, and agriculture are being harmed in ways we never imagined. These disasters are a precursor to a future where scarcity will be the norm, not the exception. What should we do in the face of all this? The first step is to recognize that resource scarcity is not just a future possibility, but an imminent reality. We need to change our approach to the environment, the way we use natural resources, and how we ensure the fair production and distribution of food. We can no longer wait for things to improve on their own. We must act now to prevent the world from sinking into a crisis of hunger and scarcity. We cannot let the fires and natural disasters that are devastating parts of the world become mere statistics, but rather a wake-up call for all of us. It's time to act. If you believe scarcity is approaching and global violence is becoming more perceptible, subscribe to the channel and stay updated on the next content about how humanity can prepare for what's coming. We can no longer wait. The change must begin now. Now, as we reflect on the fires and how they are preparing the world for scarcity, it's time to look at the next step in this apocalyptic journey. In the next topic, we will examine how violence and scarcity are preparing the way for the global destruction that the Red Rider brings with him. How do wars, scarcities, and disasters fit into a broader scenario of global destruction? Don't miss the next topic. IT will provide the key to understanding the Red Rider and his impact on the world. The war that consumes everything. The Red Rider and global destruction. When we look at the devastating fires in Los Angeles, we cannot help but think about the impact destruction has on a global level. Although the fire occurred in a specific city, it is a reflection of something much greater. The Red Rider of Revelation, chapter 6, verse 4, symbolizes limitless destruction, a violence that consumes everything it encounters. And by analyzing what happened in Los Angeles, we can clearly see how this global destruction is reflected in our reality. Have you ever stopped to think about how fires are a sign of broader destruction? The fire in Los Angeles is not just an isolated accident, but a reflection of what is happening in many parts of the world. Violence and destruction are spreading, consuming everything. From wars to natural disasters like the fires, we are seeing a rising wave of violence and destruction. The Red Rider, with his sharp sword, is symbolizing this global destruction that is coming, and the world is becoming increasingly vulnerable to this wave of chaos. The war and violence we see today are clear signs that something much larger is approaching. The world seems to be on the brink of collapse, with rising political, economic, and social tensions. Conflicts and natural disasters are becoming more frequent and intense, creating a scenario of destruction that is much more widespread than we can imagine. The Red Rider doesn't just bring war, but a violence so unpredictable and devastating that it consumes everything in its path. The fire in Los Angeles, like other global disasters, serves as a warning that destruction will no longer be limited to one region or country. War, violence, and destruction that come with the Red Rider are spreading across the planet. What we are seeing, therefore, are not isolated incidents, but a clear demonstration of how the world, is becoming increasingly vulnerable to global devastation. The wars and conflicts in various parts of the world are just the beginning of something much greater that is about to happen. Can you see the global dimension of the destruction the Red Rider represents? The fires in Los Angeles are not just a local crisis, but a reflection of how disasters can start in a small part of the world and, over time, spread to other places. The violence and destruction we see today are signs that we are approaching a period of great tribulations. The fire that consumes everything not only symbolizes physical destruction, but also reminds us of the spiritual destruction that accompanies these events. The question we must ask ourselves now is, are we spiritually prepared to face what is to come? Global destruction is not just a matter of physical or material disaster. The real question is how we are spiritually preparing to face the times of tribulation that are coming. The world is collapsing, and it is crucial that we are spiritually strengthened to face the adversities that will come with war and destruction. We cannot wait for peace to be restored without a deep transformation in our hearts and actions. Now, more than ever, we must act with wisdom and care. We can no longer ignore the signs that are around us. The Red Rider warns us that global violence and destruction are just the beginning of a broader process that will affect humanity as a whole. It's time for us to spiritually prepare for what's to come. We must turn to faith, pray for wisdom, peace, and protection, and strengthen our connection with God. If you want to understand better how to spiritually prepare for the times ahead, don't forget to download our ebook, available in the link of the first pinned comment. We can no longer wait to act. Now is the time to prepare for what is to come. Now that we have reflected on the destruction approaching, it's time to look at the hope that awaits us. In the next topic, we will explore how, even in the midst of violence and destruction, there is a promise of hope. Let's understand how the promise of a new heaven and a new earth gives us the strength to face the difficult times ahead. Don't miss it. The best is yet to come. Hope amidst violence. The promise of a new heaven and new earth. Amid so much violence and destruction, it's easy to feel lost, as if there's no more hope. The Red Rider brings with him a wave of war and chaos, leaving behind a trail of suffering. But no matter how dark the situation seems, there's a light shining at the end of the tunnel. The Bible offers us a promise of hope that can strengthen us and bring us peace even in difficult times. Though the world is being consumed by violence and disasters, God promises us a new heaven and a new earth, where there will be no more pain, suffering, or death. In Revelation, chapter 21, verses 1-4, God gives us a marvelous vision of the future. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God." These words are the promise that, although the world around us is being devastated, there is a future of peace and renewal reserved for the faithful. Christ's victory over evil will be final. He has already conquered death, and evil no longer has power over those who follow him. When we see suffering in the world, we can remember this promise. Even when things seem hopeless now, God has already prepared a place where pain and violence will no longer have room. The violence and suffering we see in the world are only temporary, and the future that awaits us is one of peace and restoration. Christ, through his resurrection, ensured that the final victory over evil is certain. The suffering we see now will be replaced by eternal joy and peace that comes from being in the presence of God. When we find ourselves in the midst of difficulties, we can hold on to this truth. Christ's victory is ours as well. The violence that today seems to dominate the world, represented by the Red Rider, does not have the last word. God has the last word, and he promises us a future free of pain, war, and suffering. The new Jerusalem, the city coming down from heaven, will be the place where we will live in peace with God. There will be no more death, no mourning, no pain, because the former things will have passed away. This is what God promises his children. The violence and destruction we see today are only preparing us for what is to come, a perfect restoration of the world, where we will live in harmony with God and with each other, with no more suffering or conflict. So, no matter how much violence and pain afflict us now, we can be certain that, in the end, God's peace will be restored. We can trust that he is in control and that Even though the world is in chaos, his victory is certain. In Christ, we have hope and the assurance of a glorious future. The promise of a new heaven and a new earth is for all those who follow him, a promise that one day, everything will be renewed and perfect. If you believe in the promise of peace and hope that comes from God, leave a like and tell us in the comments how this promise has touched your heart. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe now to continue receiving messages of hope and faith. Together, we can face the challenges of the world with the certainty that Christ's victory guarantees us a better future. May God bless your life, your family, and your friends, and may the peace that only he can give always be with you. Until the next video,